Welcome to Patscast. I'm Brad Whitaker. What better time to talk about future NFL QB prospects than right now with two, I would say, second-tier quarterbacks, Washington's Michael Penix Jr. and Michigan's J.J. McCarthy, who are set to face off next week in the college football playoff national championship game. As of right now, the New England Patriots have the number 3 overall pick heading into their season finale. But that can change dramatically, particularly if they beat the New York Jets on Sunday, which right now they're favorites. I think it's a big likelihood just because the Patriots have always had the Jets number. So we have to start looking at some of those other picks that they may potentially end up with if they fall out of that top 3 or 4. Victory would likely place them somewhere between number 4 and number 7. Meaning Caleb Williams, Drake May, and Jaden Daniels may all be off the board by the time the Patriots select. I think 6 or 7 is a reach, just looking at the strength of schedule of like the Giants and the Chargers, who it would take a lot to play out for them to leapfrog the Patriots, but it's still very possible. That said, a win likely puts them at 4 or 5 if I had to predict, and those quarterbacks may be off the board. I say you pick one of those top 3 if they're available, but you're going to have other options, including Michael Penix and J.J. McCarthy, if you don't get one of those top picks. And even if you do have the opportunity to select Caleb Williams or Jaden Daniels or Drake May, maybe the Patriots look at them and say, I'm not as impressed as some of these other teams are. And if that's the case, you have to seriously consider a guy like Marvin Harrison Jr. at wide receiver. He's as close to a sure thing as you're ever going to get at that position. Immediately a top 15, top 10 wide receiver on day one. Patriots, particularly if Bill Belichick is still there as the GM, he's never had luck drafting receivers. You might as well get that sure thing early on, get that number 1 guy to pair with Demario Douglas, and then you got all the B- receivers that they have that will have a bigger role because defenses will be more focused on those 2 guys right at the start of the season. Or they may be forced to select one of the top tackles, Joe Alt from Notre Dame, Olu Fashanu from Penn State. There's a few other guys that are expected to go in the top 10 or top 15. That's not a bad option either. Marvin Harrison isn't available and you can't get one of those top quarterbacks. But if either is the case, the Patriots will be forced to select their potential future starting quarterback in the second round or perhaps trade back into the first round. That's where they will likely find one of these guys, Michael Penix or J.J. McCarthy. But let's start breaking down both of these quarterbacks and see if they would be a good fit for the Patriots heading into the 2024 NFL season. We'll start with Michael Penix. As we all know, he finished second in the Heisman race to Jaden Daniels, but if you watch the college football playoff semifinal, a lot of people are regretting that decision. Penix threw for 430 yards, 29 of 38 passing, and 2 touchdown passes. Really put on an impressive performance and probably moved him further up into the first round. If I had to predict at this point, we'll see what happens in the national championship game. A lot can happen between now and April. There are some questions with Penix, which I'll go over in a minute, but some of his strengths, we'll start with his arm. Michael Penix has a bit of an awkward throwing motion. Part of that is because he is a left-handed quarterback, but it looks a little weird sometimes. The first time you see it, you go, oh, this is a little strange. But do not let that fool you on his mechanics. First of all, he's got a sneaky strong arm. Like, it doesn't look like he's throwing it very hard until you see the ball come out of his hands. And we saw that on Monday against Texas. He has just an incredible touch. He can throw the ball 40, 50 yards with no effort at all. And he can throw it very accurately, too. And he can throw it hard and quickly, too, if he needs to do that. Not to mention, he's also a fairly accurate quarterback. Occasionally, he will overthrow his receivers. We did see that last night against Texas. But for the most part, he is one of the more accurate quarterbacks in the draft. And he can also throw pretty well on the run. He's one of those guys that feels very comfortable throwing on the run. I think the biggest drawback, however, with Penix, and this would be a reason he might drop into the second round, even though he finished second in the Heisman, even though he may win the national championship next week or continues to put on these incredibly impressive performances, he has a big injury history. He has multiple ACL tears during his time at Indiana before he transferred to Washington. Something you also have to consider, you look at the Washington Huskies offense, they got a pretty decent O-line, but they also have elite wide receivers. And again, we saw that with Texas. This is like one of those Mac Jones situations, right, where he had a better receiving core at Alabama than he did his 3 seasons with the Patriots. It's going to be perhaps a similar situation for Michael Penix, unless, of course, they end up with Marvin Harrison Jr. bringing in a number 1 wide receiver in free agency. That said, he's a real field general who's capable of dissecting defensive alignments pre-snap. That is so huge for an NFL starting quarterback. That could give him the job as the starter if the Patriots select him on day 1, because that was kind of the strength with Mac Jones. That's why before Mac Jones became really scared of the pass rush, he looked really poised and confident out there. And I think that's something we would see with Michael Penix, who would be able to step into that starting role right away. He's also a really strong leader, perhaps the most ready to command an NFL offense in the draft. Anyone that talks about Michael Penix says nothing but great things about his discipline, his leadership in the locker room, his leadership on the field, how he plays in practice. And obviously he's overcome a lot of adversity with his injury history. That is a bit of a weakness for teams that are concerned he might get hurt, but it's also a strength knowing that he can bounce back the way he does. And this is a guy that has a history of bouncing back in the game. He bounces back quickly from mistakes that he makes or when he gets sacked, which you can't say about a guy like Mac Jones, who gets rattled very easily. Michael Penix, on the other hand, does not get rattled very easily. He also has an NFL-ready athletic build. He's 6'3", 213 pounds. Now, I would take that with a grain of salt. I think when you put him out there with NFL players, similar to Mac Jones, who looked like a tall quarterback at Alabama, and then you saw him in the NFL, and he said, okay, he's not actually that tall. Michael Penix may look a little bit smaller when you see him out there with NFL offensive linemen and defensive linemen standing in front of him. But he's got a very good build, can be very mobile in the pocket, certainly can extend plays. We saw that last night. Not the fastest, but he is fast enough. I think he ran a 4.7 40 when he was coming out of high school. He may be a little bit faster now, you would hope. But he's capable of scrambling, but doesn't need to often. He certainly hasn't had to a lot at Washington. I think a comp that I've heard, I'm not sure it's entirely accurate, but I've seen a lot of people compare him to Donovan McNabb. Kind of a similar release, similar build. You can be mobile if necessary, not super fast, but I think we would be very happy as Patriots fans seeing Michael Penix Jr. behind center. But let's analyze J.J. McCarthy, the guy from Michigan he'll be going up against next Monday in the championship game. McCarthy is perhaps the biggest wild card in the draft. He could be a first rounder, particularly if he performs well in the championship game. Or he may even fall to the 3rd or 4th round. If I had to predict, I think he's probably like a mid-second round pick. I think the biggest issue with McCarthy is he hasn't been asked to do a lot compared to all these other top quarterbacks in the draft because Michigan has such a run-first attack offense under Jim Harbaugh. That said, McCarthy, and we've seen this plenty of times. The first time I really saw it and really watched him play was against Ohio State last season, where he really stepped up when he needs to make a big play, when he needs to win the game and march the team down the field, or like he did in overtime against Alabama at the Rose Bowl. He's highly competent, and he can make those plays at the right time, and that's perhaps his biggest strength. His arm strength is almost too strong at times. Like he's kind of Brett Favre-like. Like sometimes he throws it too hard. We saw that at the Rose Bowl with some of his receivers, just seeing the ball slip through their hands because it came at them so quickly. He can throw a deep ball because of his arm strength, but I think sometimes he has a little bit of trouble deciding between a soft touch and a cannon, kind of the opposite of Michael Penix, who really is good at deciding, do I throw it hard? Do I throw a touch? Do I throw a lob? J.J. McCarthy is a little bit all over the place, and sometimes he's a bit of a gunslinger out there. But arm strength is certainly not a weakness for him. He may have, perhaps, when he winds up, the strongest arm in the draft. I think he just throws it a little too hard at times. He'll throw a cannon 5 yards, and the receivers aren't even ready for it. But he is fantastic at throwing on the run. He loves to roll out. You can see him really fitting well in those like wide zone, bootleg ready, modern NFL offenses. Like if he played for a Kyle Shanahan, J.J. McCarthy would do very well in that type of offense. He's certainly ready for modern NFL offenses in that aspect. His accuracy is decent for the most part, but sometimes because he has trouble adjusting his arm strength depending on how short or how far he has to throw the ball, sometimes he'll force his receivers to adjust a little bit. So accuracy is a bit of an issue, but not as much as I think a lot of so-called NFL draft gurus are going to make it out to be. He's the same height as Michael Penix, but definitely has a much skinnier, wiry frame, so there are some concerns there. Can he take hits in a modern NFL offense? Certainly behind that Michigan O-line, hasn't taken a lot of hits in college, but he had to go against Alabama, and he held up pretty well and was able to come up big there in overtime, even though they did run the ball quite often. Has a very high football IQ, according to everyone that talks about him. But I think this is the biggest drawback with J.J. McCarthy, is he needs to do a better job at reading defenses. Michael Penix seems like he'd be ready on day one in the NFL, whereas there may be a little bit more time for development for J.J. McCarthy there in terms of reading defenses pre-snap, going through the progressions, hitting receivers throughout the entire route tree. He has trouble sometimes, especially throwing to the sideline to his right. He did have what should have been a Mac Jones-style interception, kind of like Mac Jones threw in Week 2 against the Miami Dolphins, where he was throwing on the run to the sideline and got picked off. Now, the cornerback stepped out of bounds before he caught the ball, but it should have been an INT and probably would have been in the NFL. So you got to avoid those mistakes, and luckily he caught a big break there in the Rose Bowl game, but that's a big concern in the NFL. And another thing with McCarthy is it's very possible he decides to stay at Michigan another year. If he sees himself as a third or fourth round draft prospect, which he very well may be, then there really is serious consideration, because Michigan's probably going to still be very good, potentially a college football playoff team again next year. Why not build on that with a weaker quarterback class and put yourself in that first round conversation? Because next year it's really hard to know who the great quarterbacks are going to be. I'm sure you're going to have Shedeur Sanders going early. He's going to get a ton of transfers, so he'll probably be a top pick. But J.J. McCarthy, with another year in that system, with a little bit more responsibility perhaps, could find himself in the first round, whereas he may be second or third or even fourth round in 2024. But we'll see what he decides to do, especially if they do win a national championship. Maybe he wants to enter the NFL right away, coming off that high. But the great thing about this draft is there are a lot of solid second-tier quarterback prospects who could eventually become top-tier quarterbacks under the right circumstances. Certainly, New England has a lot to deal with in terms of beefing up that offensive line, although it looks a lot better now. I feel good about that O-line as long as they address the tackle position this offseason. But you also need to get more weapons at receiver. Maybe bring back Hunter Henry, franchise tag him or something, and get a good number one receiver. And then whomever that quarterback is in 2024, they're entering a better situation than Mac Jones and Bailey Zappi have had to deal with. I obviously am more in the camp of Michael Penix. He seems like a much better fit for the Patriots, particularly as they continue to address the uncertainties with that offensive line. It'd be good to have someone that can be mobile but also hang in the pocket, scramble if he needs to, but is going to be able to run a complex offense, go through the progression, make adjustments pre-snap. Michael Penix has that. J.J. McCarthy really does not. But Michael Penix may not be available because Patriots aren't going to use a number 5 pick on Penix. They're going to draft Harrison Jr. or Neighbors from LSU or one of those top tackles in all likelihood. So if they want to get Michael Penix, particularly coming out of the high of the college football playoff, they may have to trade back into the first round to get him. That said, if either is selected, it's no guarantee they would be the starter week 1. I think Penix probably would be, but I would expect a real competition with Bailey Zappi as they try to develop J.J. McCarthy. Again, if it's Bailey Zappi and Michael Penix, I think Penix is probably going to win that battle. But you have a real quarterback competition, I think, if you select a guy like J.J. McCarthy, because Bailey Zappi has continued to improve, and who knows what he could do with a full offseason, getting first-team reps. If you get a real developmental guy like J.J. McCarthy, maybe you want Bailey to be that bridge until he's ready to go either later in the season or perhaps his sophomore year in the NFL. Let me know what you think in the comments. Are you really high on Michael Penix? Would you like to see them select a Marvin Harrison Jr. and then get Michael Penix in the second round or later in the first round? I think that would be like the best draft ever, by the way. As much as I like Caleb Williams, Jaden Daniels, and Drake Mayen, you got to select one of those guys if they're available. But if you get Harrison Jr. and then you're able to get Penix, that's a pretty damn good draft, and you'd have to feel pretty happy coming out of that. But let me know. Maybe you're high on J.J. McCarthy. Hasn't been asked to do a lot, but there's a lot of really good tools there, and he could really develop into a decent NFL quarterback under the right circumstances. So let me know, and stay tuned to Pat's Cast throughout this week and into next week as the NFL regular season wraps up. It's going to be a lot of interesting storylines about Bill Belichick's future, what they do at the quarterback position, who they select in the draft, where they land in the draft. Be sure to subscribe if you're watching on YouTube. It's going to be a lot of great content coming out, and the storylines are only going to get more interesting in the next few weeks, so stay tuned.